All yours.
Yeah. So good morning, everyone, and we are very happy to welcome you to Professor Partha Chatterjee's next two talks. And today's talk is called this is Violence and the Making of the Modern State, and it's part of the Modernity and the Making of the Social course, MPhil course for students here. And we are now going live on. Partha, thank you again for all of these fascinating talks, and we are looking forward to today's talk. So over to you, Partha.
Thank you, Shobik. Thank you, Lenny, and good morning to everyone. So these two lectures, they come in the component called Violence and the Making of the Modern State. In the original schedule, this was supposed to have come much later, but because of various scheduling problems, this has been brought forward. I don't think this will make much difference to the sequence of the various components of the course, because in some ways this is fairly self-contained, this particular topic. What we will do is focus on yet another very classic text, which is the Leviathan by Thomas Hobbes. I will introduce the text in a minute. But what we'll do is we'll first focus on Hobbes's sort of central arguments. And these are arguments about, in some ways, foundational arguments about the sovereignty of modern states, the claims of the modern state to sovereignty. Now, there are some very distinctive characteristics to Hobbes's particular argument. This is a claim of absolute sovereignty, and there is a theory of political obligation of all citizens, as it were, to the state. Hobbes calls them the subjects of the sovereign, to the state. Now, these are, we will see, not the usual way in which we think of the relationship between the state and citizens today. In fact, Hobbes's arguments are generally speaking completely rejected by most modern liberal thinkers. As we will see, Hobbes's whole argument about how the state is founded, there is no conception of a constitution. All modern states today we think as being founded on the basis of a constitution, which defines the respective rights of the state and the citizens. In other words, citizens have rights against the state, right? Now, this is not something you have in Hobbes. In Hobbes, you have what could be called an absolute theory of sovereignty. But it is a theory, nevertheless, of the modern state. He makes it very, very clear that what he is arguing for is not a continuation of the old monarchical kind of state. In other words, the kinds of sovereignty that an old monarch in the old system might have claimed, that is not the sovereignty Hobbes is claiming. Now, in a sense, Hobbes's key argument, and let me give you this at the very beginning, his key argument is that the state has to have complete control over the means of violence in order to prevent violence in society. That is the key justification for having a state, a sovereign state, that the state will in fact protect its subjects. Now, how does Hobbes go about making this argument? It's very interesting, and we can then discuss to what extent his insight is still relevant. Now, to introduce Thomas Hobbes, he wrote mainly in the 17th century. and wrote, in fact, in the period of the English Civil War, which took place in the 1640s. Hobbes was educated in Oxford. In those days, of course, you did not have the kind of academic professions that we are used to. So he basically engaged, he was engaged as a tutor to an aristocratic family, the Cavendish family. He was tutor to the sons of that family. And he toured with them, toured Europe in between 1630 and 37, taking his wards around the various European capitals and showing them, the great historical and cultural traditions of Europe. He returned to England and then wrote a tract called Elements of Law in 1640. Now, this was actually not published. It was circulated clandestinely, so circulated sort of underground circulation. During this period, 1640, the Civil War basically broke out 1642, and this was a period of great unrest in England. And in this period of unrest, this book circulated underground, and the supporters of Parliament. So as I will just tell you a little bit about the English Civil War. Some of you who studied history, English history, will probably know this. But the struggle was really between those who supported the continued authority of the monarchy, and the supporters of the Parliament were on the other side. They wanted Parliament to be declared as supreme. And so the anti-monarchical supporters of Parliament were angered by Hobbes's book, which was read as a support for the monarchy. So Hobbes actually had to run away. He fled to France and then published these two books, De Cive and Leviathan, 1647 and 1651. Leviathan, which of course is his most famous book, now this time it angered the royalists. It angered royalists and Catholics in France. Hobbes returned to England, and after that he just led a private life. He was hardly ever, did not participate in public debates or anything anymore. Of course, he was fairly elderly by this time. He died in 1679. Okay. Oh, no. Just a minute. Okay. Now, 1651 is the Leviathan. Are you getting my video?
Oh, no, no, Partha. We are not seeing your share screen.
So, is there a video?
I think I've lost, my camera is...
We can see you, but we can't see your PowerPoint.
Yes, I know.
You may have to share screen again.
Yeah.
Yes, we can see your screen now.
Right. Let me go to this.
Yes, we can see the PowerPoint now.
Yeah. Let me try and enlarge this. Okay. trying to get a full screen. Anyway, can't get a full screen.
At the bottom, Partha, you can, at the bottom, you can click the third icon, which says read mode.
No, no,
Or
I don't have that.
Okay. I think this is fine.
This will work.
This should be fine. Yeah. You have to just go down.
But because I think your some of the text is being hidden.
we can see the full slide.
We can see the full slide. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So this book is famous for the theory of absolute sovereignty, as I said. Hobbes's theory is contradictory. Is contradicted by the principles of representative government and liberal democracy, which is what most modern states are founded on. But as I said, it contains a key insight about the need for state violence to contain violence in society. And we'll have to see to what extent this insight is still relevant. Okay, the English Civil War, this took place in the 1640s. So on the one side, you had the parliamentarians, so-called roundheads, because they had these hats which they wore, which were round. And then they fought with the royalists, who were called the cavaliers, over how England should be ruled. And as I said, the basic dispute was whether monarchy should be absolute and supreme, or whether parliament should have the supreme powers to make laws. And so on the parliamentarian side, the leader who soon emerged was Oliver Cromwell, who he had set up his, established his own army called the New Model Army. And this New Model Army was fairly successful. And following these successes, Charles, who was then the ruler, Charles I, was actually tried and executed. And you can see a little lithograph. This was, of course, not done at the time. It was done some years later, where you can see Charles kind of peacefully lying down while this chopper is coming on his head. The king was in fact executed in this revolution, the Civil War. England was then ruled by what was called the Commonwealth, and this term from this time onwards become very widespread, and we will see this being used in Hobbes as well. The Commonwealth, which ruled from 1649 to 53, and then Cromwell, he emerged as, he called himself the Lord Protector. It was effectively a dictatorship of Cromwell, who ruled England until his death in 1658. The monarchy was then restored in 1660. So that's the history of the Civil War, and it's in the context of the Civil War that Hobbes was writing wrote his book, The Leviathan. Hobbes, his sort of intellectual background, as I said, that he toured Europe in the 1930s and early 30s, and then went back again in the 40s during the period of the Civil War. So he was very much in close contact with various European philosophers and thinkers of the time, particularly with Descartes. There are correspondences between Hobbes and Descartes, with Leibniz, who was the philosopher, the mathematician, and in England with Robert Boyle, who was the experimental physicist for the sort of establishing the method of experiments. as the way to confirm theories of nature. And some of you who may continue into the second semester, there is a course where in fact, if you read Bruno Latour, particularly, there's a book, We Have Never Been Modern. This book may in fact be taught in the second semester. And Latour in fact talks extensively of a dispute between Hobbes and Boyle, because Hobbes, and this is interesting in the context of Leviathan too, and Hobbes's method of argument. Hobbes completely rejected the idea that inference from empirical experiments might actually be a method to find the truth. He completely rejected this. According to him, truth or science can only proceed on the basis of deduction. There are certain fundamental assumptions that you can draw from which various deductions can be made logically. And that is the only method of proper science. So this was an early dispute. Of course, as we know, in the practice of science, these two things have since gone hand in hand. On the one hand, you have a lot of completely theoretical speculations about nature, for instance, many of which have never been confirmed because they simply cannot be put down or confirmed by experiment. On the other hand, there is a whole tradition of experimental science, which essentially tries to put to the test various theories that are proposed by theoretical physicists, theoretical scientists. They are put to the test. And in a sense, the basic assumption or basic practice is that it's only when theories are properly confirmed by experimental methods that they actually become acceptable. Otherwise, they remain speculations. But Hobbes, as I said, did not believe in this idea of purely experimental or inductive forms of inquiry. And we'll see that the whole structure of the Leviathan is in fact completely deductive. Now, there is a very short introduction to the Leviathan. Hobbes' own introduction, in which he makes the following statements: that by imitating nature, man can make artificial animals. That is to say, automata, machines that move, such as a watch. Okay, now what is a watch? It is made by men, but it is made by men by imitating nature. That is to say, men observe nature, they study nature, they discover how nature works, and then they can make machines. And the word machine is fairly new in circulation in this time when Hobbes is writing. Automata, that is to say, machines that can move themselves, move by themselves, okay, like a watch, which moves by itself. So man can make artificial animals. This is what Hobbes is calling a watch, is an artificial animal. And he goes on to describe why this automata or machines are actually like animals. The heart becomes a spring, the nerves strings, the joints are wheels that move the body. Okay, by art is created the Leviathan, called the Commonwealth or state, which is but an artificial man. Now, so this is a completely new idea that the state is actually a creation of men. Men make the state, and they make the state like a machine that moves by itself. It is an artificial man made by men. Okay, so sovereignty is an artificial soul. Officials are artificial joints. Rewards and punishment are the nerves. Wealth and riches are the strength. People's safety is the business, and sedition and civil war are like death. So that is an artificial man, which is the state. Okay, all of these characteristics of the state, sovereignty, officials, wealth, right, people's safety, civil war, all of these can be described in terms of the lives of men. So like the fiat of God that created man, covenants or contracts, Hobbes will use both of these terms. Sometimes he'll call it covenant and sometimes he will say contract. So covenants or contracts create the state. So you can see how radical or almost revolutionary a claim Hobbes is making. He is making the claim that just as God created man, man can create a state. In other words, clearly what he's rejecting is any kind of doctrine of the state being a divine creation or the monarchy having powers that are divine. God has nothing to do with it. Okay, so in the whole context of, you can think of medieval Europe, the idea of monarchy, the relation between church and state, all of those things. And in fact, in many, many other countries as well, the idea of the king or monarch having some kind of divine authority is very widespread. But this is what Hobbes is rejecting here. He is saying that the state is actually created by humans. How? And this is where Hobbes has this very, very interesting discussion on what is often called the state of nature, because this idea will be used by later theorists who will disagree with Hobbes. For instance, Locke, in a few decades after Hobbes, right, will disagree with Hobbes's description of the state of nature. Rousseau, who will write much later, of course, in the 18th century, will also disagree completely with Hobbes, but Rousseau will also have his own argument about the state of nature. What is the state of nature? It is an imagined condition, right? Which is a natural condition. What was the condition of human lives before you had a state, before you had laws, before you had any political authority? What was the condition of human beings like? That is the natural condition. Okay, and this, of course, according to Hobbes, this is not empirically observed. You don't actually see this because no one's ever seen this condition of human beings where there are no laws, no authority, nothing. It has to be imagined. Okay, but this imagination must have some basis in nature, in the observance of nature, in actually identifying what nature is like, the true characteristics of nature. Okay, and what does Hobbes identify in this state of nature? What are human beings like in this state of nature? Mind you, this is when there are no laws, there is no authority, there is no state, all right? What are human beings like? Human beings are naturally equal in the faculties of body and mind. A very important assumption here. And Hobbes makes his argument of why he insists that in a natural condition, all humans are actually, well, men, shouldn't say human, because he is clearly excluding women and children from this, right? Men are naturally equal in the faculties of body and mind. Why? Because surely you will have, men who are stronger than others. You will have men who are cleverer than others, even in the natural condition. So why insist that they are equal? And Hobbes says that true, it's possible that some man may be physically much stronger than others, but he could still be defeated or even killed by someone who is cleverer. Someone who's cleverer. So in fact, that superior strength, superior physical strength doesn't mean anything. Or weaker people may combine. So he's calling this confederacy, combination of many. They can combine and defeat this man who has superior strength, right? And what about greater wisdom or knowledge? Because that is also unequal. But Hobbes says that that difference, greater knowledge or wisdom, is the result of experience. It's not natural mental ability. Everyone has equal natural mental ability. Some people just through experience, through exercise, through acquiring knowledge, through diligence, and so on and so forth, they manage to increase their knowledge. They manage to acquire wisdom, which others don't. But that is not a difference of natural ability. In a natural condition, everybody is equal. Now, everything else follows from this, by the way. So this is the deductive logic. Once he has established this first principle of the natural condition, that every man is equal, what then follows is equality of ability leads to equality of hope in attaining one's ends. Okay, so everybody thinks that one is equally entitled to gain what one wills, what is one's intention. I can get what I want, just as anybody else can get what he wants. We're all equal, right? So what would result if two men aspire for the same thing? They become enemies. They become enemies. They fight over the same thing. Because both aspire for it, both think they are equally entitled, and so they become enemies. And then if one man attains his ends, he will worry. So even if one attains it, even then he cannot sit back satisfied, because he will worry that others might dispossess him by force or by stealth. Okay, so he will continue to think of other people as possible enemies. So hence, in the natural condition, there is mutual diffidence. Now, this is one more thing that you may actually notice when you read something. This is like reading Shakespeare, where when you come across words that are with strange spellings, and then words which you've never heard, and of course words which are used in ways that we don't use them anymore. The meanings have changed, right? And of course, that's perfectly normal for any language, every language, right? If you think of what Bengali or Hindi or any language was, for 300 or 400 years ago, you will have the same experience, right? The English language has changed. So, but that's one of the things you encounter when you try and read Hobbes. So this is one word like that, diffidence. We normally think of diffidence as sort of a reluctance to force oneself into the public, right? A certain shyness, a certain self-effacing behavior. That is diffidence. But diffidence here actually means distrust, mutual diffidence. Why is there a mutual diffidence? Because as I've just explained, that there is equality of hope. Everybody thinks one is entitled to get what one wants. And then they fight over it. They become enemies. And then even if someone succeeds in getting what he wants, he will worry that other people might dispossess him. So he will look at everybody else with distrust. Okay? So equality, equal ability also makes men react violently against any show of slight or contempt. Again, because everybody thinks they are equal, anyone who, by his words or by his behavior seems to express some kind of contempt, that is to say, not treat everybody with equal respect, then of course, again, people will react to that kind of behavior. So there are three principal causes of quarrel among men in the natural condition. There is competition over the same things, right? There is diffidence or distrust, and there is glory, what Hobbes calls glory, which is sort of arrogance, right? Competition leads men to use violence to possess what belongs to others. That is competition. Distrust leads to securing the means of violence to defend oneself. So even when one has acquired things from others, one looks at everybody else with distrust, and so one wants to strengthen one's means of defense. Okay? And finally, glory leads to punish by violence the expression of different opinions or criticism. All right? If other people don't speak well of me, then I get angry and I can react violently. So these are the three, and these are all, Hobbes is describing them as natural emotions or natural impulses, right? Which are part of the natural makeup of human beings. So even in the state of nature, when there are no laws, there is no religion, there is no morality, none of these things exist, okay? You will have this. It will be a condition of quarrel between men because and they result, by the way, from the fact that they are all equal in their natural endowments. Okay, so the natural condition is a state of war. State of nature is a state of war. In the natural condition, there is constant war of every man against every man. Even at moments when there is no war, there is an apprehension of impending war. So this is also important. Hobbes is not saying that everybody is actually fighting all the time. But even at those periods, in those periods of apparent peace, everyone is apprehending that there will be another round of fighting. Somebody will attack me. Okay, so I must prepare myself. because somebody will attack me. So it is therefore a condition of constant war, of every man against every man. In such a condition, men have no security except what they can furnish with their own strength and wit. That is to say, the only security one can ensure is what he can get with his own strength and his own intelligence. There is no industry, no agriculture, no navigation, no science, no literature, no arts, and no society. Because all of these things require a condition of peace. People must feel secure before any of these things can happen, right? So none of those things that one associates with a good society, a good social life, can exist in the natural condition. There is constant fear and danger of violent death, right? The condition of man, and this is one of the most famous and most quoted, possibly the most quoted sentence in Hobbes. The condition of man in natural, in nature is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Okay, the life of man is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. Okay, so this is the state of nature as Hobbes describes it, and he describes it, mark again, not by actually observing any natural condition. Or he's not saying that go, I have looked at a natural condition and this is what it is. This is all by deduction, by the way. And what is the deduction proceeding from? The assumption that everyone is equal in the natural condition. That is the first assumption. Once you have made that assumption, everything else, Hobbes will insist, will follow naturally. It follows logically, sorry. It follows logically. Now, nothing is unjust in the natural condition. There is no idea of justice that has emerged, right? So let's ask, is this description of human nature strange? Hobbes actually asks that question to his readers. He asks, do you think this is a very strange description that I'm giving? And then he asks, why do men lock their doors at night? Why do they lock their chests at home, right? Why do they arm themselves when they travel, even when there are policemen? There are laws and policemen. And yet you find people, they lock their doors at night. They lock their chests and cupboards and wherever else they have valuables. Why do they do that? Why? What do they think of the motives of other men? Right? And so Hobbes says it is not a sin for men to have desires and passions. They cannot know when to act, whether an act to fulfill a desire is right or wrong, since there is no law. Only if there's a law will you know that something is right or wrong. And that law can be a law of the state, it can be a law of the church, it can be a law that is given to you by some religious authority, but some authority whom you feel obligated to will give you a law by which you will know whether a particular act is right or wrong. Now, in this condition of nature, there cannot be such law because men have not yet agreed on a person who can make the law. there is no lawmaking authority. So, in the natural condition of war, nothing is unjust. Where there is no common power, there is no law, and hence no injustice. So in this natural condition, so what Hobbes is eliminating is some notion that even in a state of nature, people have some natural sense of justice or injustice. He is completely ruling this out. There is no such thing as natural justice. Justice is something which emerges as a specific human act. Human beings create an authority which then lays down what is just and unjust, what is legitimate and what is not legitimate, what is right and what is wrong. Right? So this is really Hobbes's key sort of position. So there are three major sort of conceptual ideas that Hobbes then proposes before he moves on to describe this state that men create. Okay, what is it created out of? So one, there is a natural right or a right of nature, which is the liberty each man has to use his own powers for self-preservation and of doing anything which in his judgment is the best means for that purpose. Now, this is a natural right. This is in fact the only natural right. Right? It is a right given by nature, and what is that right? It is a right to preserve oneself. So life is given by nature, right? As a natural creature, humans have the right to use whatever in his powers to preserve oneself and for doing anything which is the best means of preserving oneself. So that is a natural right. This is a right that comes from nature, by the way. This is not a right that is given by any law or constitution or anything of the kind. It is natural. Second, there is a condition of natural liberty, freedom, which is natural. What is that? It is the absence of external impediments to a man's powers. Even if such impediments take away part of his powers, he cannot be prevented from using the rest to achieve his purposes. That is a natural liberty. The natural liberty is that I will disregard, I will overcome external impediments. And even if there are some external impediments that I cannot overcome, all right, it cannot take away my powers to use the rest to achieve my purposes. So for instance, there are two ways in which you can think of this. There are certain impediments which are natural. Nature itself imposes certain impediments. For instance, if I think I want to fly in the air and jump off the roof, okay, obviously I will not be able to do it because there is a natural impediment there. Nature will not allow me to do it. Okay, so that is an impediment, external impediment. My liberty is within those natural conditions. But within those natural conditions, supposing nature actually, or I happen to lose some natural powers. Let us say I lose the ability to walk, or I lose the ability to see. I lose the power of sight. So I have lost some powers. But that does not mean I cannot use the rest of my powers to preserve myself. I will find some way, even if, let us say, I am unable to work myself, for instance, to find all the things that I need to preserve myself. I have the liberty to find some other means. I can use my intelligence. I can ask for the help of other people and for that will need, because in this natural condition, no one has any moral obligation to anybody else, right? But I can still try to find friends, for instance. All of those things are possible. That is part of my natural liberty, because after all, what is that liberty for? The end is to preserve oneself. And then the law of nature, or a natural law, is a general rule found out by reason, by which a man is forbidden to do that which is destructive of his life, or which takes away the means of preserving his life. So that is one thing that natural law forbids one to do. That is to say, one cannot do something which is destructive of my life. That is a law of nature. Okay? And the second is one is forbidden to fail to do what we think will best preserve it. Okay? So if I think that this is the best way to preserve my life, there is a law of nature which says I must do it. Now, this law is an obligation. So there is a difference between the liberty to do something and an obligation to do something. So the natural liberty is simply the liberty that I have to use my powers to achieve whatever it is that I want. Okay, that is my natural liberty. But there is a natural legal obligation, a law, an obligation, which is that I am obliged to do what is necessary to preserve myself. Okay, I am forbidden to do something that will be destructive. So in a sense, even as a law of nature, I am forbidden to jump off the roof, because that will destroy my life. Right? That is natural. Nobody has to tell me or prevent me. That is part of my knowledge, natural knowledge of self-preservation. So these are all natural conditions, by the way. The right of nature, natural right, liberty, natural liberty, and natural law. All of these things, there is right, there is liberty, there is law in nature, in the state of nature, before there is actual man-made law. But what Hobbes has described already is that these laws, precisely because they exist, what they lead to is a constant state of war. That is the paradox. In a sense, the paradoxical situation is that in the natural conditions, there are no impediments. Everybody is equal. I am free to do anything I want as far as there is my strength. I am free to do whatever I want. Okay, but that will lead to a constant state of war where my basic natural obligation to preserve myself, that is going to be threatened. This is the natural condition that that Hobbes is describing, that it is a state where this constant state of warfare leads people to realize that they cannot preserve themselves adequately in a state of nature. Because the only thing they can depend on is their own strength and their own intelligence. That's all. And that is not adequate defense because it leads to a constant state of warfare. Even if you acquire things, you have no guarantee that you can keep them because somebody else will attack you, right? There is a constant threat to life of violent death, right? And so this is the key impetus Hobbes is pointing to, that in a situation like this, it is this fear of violent death, this fear of constant war that leads people to come together to create a state, an authority, which can give them a law. Okay, that's the basic insight. How is this done? This is done through the contract. Or the covenant. So in order to secure peace and self-defense, a man must lay down the right to all things and be contented with only so much liberty against others as he would allow others against himself. All right? Now, this is a very crucial step. People will realize that in order to achieve a condition of peace and self-protection, right, which is secure, a man must lay down the right to all things. I will have to say, I give up my claims to all things. In the state of nature, I had a claim to everything. Anything that I could secure by my own strength and intelligence was mine, until somebody else took it away from me. Because there was no law, nothing that gives me a title. Right? There was no such thing. Okay? So I did have a right to everything. But we all realize what that leads to. That leads to this condition of constant warfare, constant enmity, constant distrust. Okay? There is no secure condition to carry out any creative pursuit in life. Yes, as Hobbes says, there is no industry, there is no agriculture, there's no science, there's no arts. None of these things exist. So people realize they have to give up this natural right that they have to all things, right? So how will they give it up? I will have to say to others, I will give up all my claims to all things if all of you also give up your claims to all things. This is achieved by a contract. A contract through which every man transfers all his rights to a sovereign. Now, this is the most interesting step that Hobbes is claiming. We all give up our rights, right? But we don't give it to each other. Because then, of course, fundamentally, nobody trusts others. There is no ground to trust anyone else. So we all give it to another person who is not even a party to this contract. And that is the sovereign. We transfer all our natural claims, our natural rights, to a sovereign who is not a party to the contract and is not bound by any obligation to his subjects. So this contract is not a constitution which is intended to set limits to the powers of the state. Every constitution that we know today whether good, bad, whether it's observed or not observed, right? But they all are intended to set certain limits to the powers of the state. And they define rights of citizens against the state. That's the whole point of a constitution. And that's the constitution which supposedly creates a modern state. Hobbes's state is not founded, even though it's founded on an agreement among all peoples. It's a contract. But it is not like the constitution we know, which sets limits to the powers of the state. Here, the sovereign power is not even a party to the contract. The sovereign power has no obligations to anybody else. The sovereign power is not signing anything, if you think of it this way. All the signatories are the people in the state of nature who come together. You can think of this, imagine a kind of contract being written up where everybody signs. We all sign to say we are renouncing all our rights in favor of this sovereign. We name that sovereign, our representative. Okay, but that sovereign is not a party to the contract. He is not bound by anything. That is Hobbes's solution to this problem of constant warfare and the constant threat of violence and death in the natural condition. So this is the Commonwealth or the state that is created by this contract or covenant. The common power is created by all men conferring all their powers on one man or one assembly of men, such that all their wills are reduced to one will. Okay, now, Hobbes therefore is not necessarily saying it has to be one king or monarch. It need not be one person, it could be an assembly. So, if you think of the context of the Civil War, for instance, right? Hobbes might be interpreted as saying that it doesn't matter whether the head of the state, this ruler, this sovereign, is a monarch or if it is parliament. It can be parliament, right? But parliament as a body is not part of the contract. Parliament as a body has absolute sovereignty, and people have no rights against parliament. That would be the assembly. So the sovereign, in other words, whether it is a single person or whether it is an assembly of persons, right? Everybody in natural society or this condition of nature, there's no society, properly speaking, in this natural condition. Everybody surrenders all their natural claims to this one body, either a monarch or an assembly, so that all their wills are reduced to one will. One man or assembly of men is thus appointed to bear their person. So the collective is represented in the body or the person of this sovereign. Everyone acknowledges himself to be the author of whatever this appointed person does to achieve the common peace. They submit their wills to his will and their judgments to his judgment. Now, this is a very important move that Hobbes is making, because from this will come his argument about what is the obligation of subjects to the sovereign. And the obligation comes from this implication of the contract, right? That everyone acknowledges himself to be the author of everything that this appointed person does. So the appointed person is a representative of the collective body, right? Whether that's a monarch or whether it's parliament. That is a representative body. But this representative body, whatever this representative body does, every subject who was part of the original contract, that is well, acknowledges that he is the author of everything that the representative does. The representative, in other words, does not do anything, right, which is not already authorized by the subjects. So this is the theory of authorization, you know, to acknowledge oneself to be the author. Everyone acknowledges himself to be the author of whatever the representative does. In other words, the representative is authorized now to do whatever is necessary on behalf of the society or of the citizens, right? And every citizen is then the author of what the sovereign does. So this is more than simply consent. It is not saying that I agree with what the state is doing. It is a real unity of them all in one and the same person, made by covenant or contract of every man with every man. Thus, each man says to each man, I authorize and give up my right to govern myself to this man or assembly on the condition that you give up your right to him and authorize his actions. Everyone does this equally, okay? Everyone gives up their rights to this sovereign, right? Representative who is the sovereign. And then everything that this sovereign will do henceforth is authorized by us. The multitude now united in one person is the Commonwealth, or civitas, which is the Latin for state. Right? This is how the Leviathan and Hobbes very interestingly calls this the mortal God is created. This is not the immortal God. This is the mortal God, right? Born. It is born, and Hobbes will say the state can die. Civil war, sedition will lead to the destruction of a state. This is how the Leviathan or mortal God is created, through the contract of men. Any questions so far?
Sir,
Yes, please.
I just had a question. In this particular line where Hobbes writes, every man authorizes and gives up their rights, isn't the concepts contradictory? Like, doesn't authorize also have an implication of having an authority over someone else's action, whereas give up is like complete surrender?
No. To authorize somebody, it's like, supposing I authorize you to represent me in a court of law, right? So what is that authorization? Suppose, you know, what in law, for instance, we call it the power of attorney. So I write a statement. It's to say that Rajarshi Dasgupta I authorize Rajarshi Dasgupta to represent me. This is exactly, so therefore, whatever you may do on my behalf, I will accept responsibility for it because I have authorized you, right? This is the idea, in a sense, what authorize actually, and Hobbes goes back and uses the words exactly in that way. I am author then of everything that you do. because I have authorized you. Right? So that's the understanding. That is what the contract is doing. By the contract, everybody is authorizing the sovereign to act on their behalf. And so that is the authorization. And so what that authorization does is make everybody the author of what the sovereign does. That's the meaning of the term author or authorization.
Thank you, sir.
Okay.
Sir, I had another question.
Yes.
If all will becomes one will, then how does the question of free will figure in this context?
We'll come to that. Hobbes will discuss this question of what is liberty or freedom in a situation like this. It is important. We will see this. There will be, you see, freedom or liberty, you can actually anticipate this answer. Hobbes will say that is precisely the freedom to do industry and agriculture and arts and science and everything else that you would want to do. That is the freedom you will have, right? But in order to have that freedom, that is a freedom you did have in natural society, except nobody was able to realize that freedom because of this constant state of war and the apprehension of fear that there would be violent death. There was no sense of security. And if you did not have a sense of general security, none of these pursuits of life, what you can do with your liberty, with your personal liberty, you cannot do anything with your personal. Those are natural liberties, Hobbes is admitting. But because you cannot do them, what people agree, they realize that condition in natural society, and then they come together, agree to give up all of these rights to this one sovereign who will, on their behalf, ensure safety and peace. Once that happens, everything else that you have, you are free to use. You can do industry, you can do agriculture, you can acquire wealth, you can have property, you can pursue your arts and poetry and music and anything else that you want within the law. Within the law, because the law is precisely those limits on your liberty which are equally applicable to everybody and which are necessary to preserve safety, the common safety. Right? That is the key argument. It is the key argument, and this, we'll come back to this. In a sense, this is the key argument for any kind of state violence or the claim of state violence. Right? Whenever a state or government says, we must have this power, this liberty, this curtailment of your liberty. Think of all the travel restrictions and that you have under the pandemic lockdown. All of these things these are restrictions on your personal liberty, right? And yet, presumably, we all accept it because we have given the government or our representative this authority to decide what restrictions, common restrictions on everybody's liberties is necessary in order to preserve or bring back a condition of security. Right? Now, that is the key argument which will keep coming back. Now, whether this argument is used properly, whether it's an appropriate argument, whether this is a cynical argument, all of those questions can come up. But this is the fundamental structure of an argument which Hobbes is producing. Right? We will come back to this and why, for instance, in some ways, even though everybody formally will say, oh, Hobbes is all wrong, we don't accept him, right? But in some ways, you will find that the kernel of Hobbes's claim is somehow conceded by all forms of the modern state. We'll come back to this because this is probably the most interesting question here.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah. Okay. So the sovereign, therefore, represents the collective body of the state. He represents. There is a collective body of the state which consists of all subjects, everybody who is part of the state, who came into the contract, as it were. The sovereign represents them. The Commonwealth, thus, is one person of whose acts a great multitude, by mutual covenants, have made themselves the author, such that he may use the strength of them all as he thinks fit for their peace and common defense. So that is the Commonwealth is one person or a body, an assembly. So a great multitude. A multitude is a very important term. A multitude consists of many. So multitude is a condition when there are many individuals who are all separated, right? That a multitude is different from a republic. A multitude is different from the members of a commonwealth, right? A multitude is a condition when the many are all separate, okay? But this is when a great multitude, by mutual agreements between themselves, they make themselves the author of everything that this one person or the Commonwealth does. Okay, so what the representative of the Commonwealth will do is to use the strength of everybody together to do what is necessary for the common peace and defense. He that carries this person is the sovereign, who has sovereign power. Everybody else is his subject. All right, everyone else is his subject. The representative is chosen. Now, this is also particularly interesting. This is often overlooked. The representative is chosen by the major part of the multitude. So when you have this agreement, it is not necessary that everybody necessarily unanimously agree on who the sovereign will be. They all agree that a sovereign power is necessary. That is why they come into the contract. If somebody thinks that a sovereign power or a commonwealth is not necessary, then that person is not even a party to the agreement. Presumably that person prefers to continue in the state of nature. And we will see why, what the implication of that will be. But assuming that everybody enters into a contract, gives up, agrees to give up all their powers, just like anybody else. But there is a difference among all these. Who should be the sovereign? How is that decided? It is decided by a majority, by the opinion of the majority. The representative is chosen by the major part of the multitude. Now, all actions of the representative are authorized by them, whether they voted for or against. Now, this is, in a sense, of course, Hobbes is stating here what is still an assumption, right, of so-called democratic decision-making, right? When there is a democratic decision, so we have elections, for instance, and we have to choose between representatives. There's no unanimity. And the rule is that the major part, whoever has the majority, that person will be chosen as the representative. But But the presumption also is that those who did not vote for that representative are still obliged to accept the decisions or actions made by that representative, right? Because they have all agreed on the principle of representation. They participated. The majority opinion prevails, but those who were in the minority who did not agree are still obliged to accept the authority of the representative as chosen by this procedure. So whether they voted for that representative or not, they are still authorizing the representative. Now, here what Hobbes is doing is, clearly we've seen this several times now in many of these steps. Hobbes is countering the divine right of sovereignty by showing that the state is a product of human invention. All right? There's no God here. God does not enter the picture at all, right? What God created was a state of nature, right? God's creation was a state of nature. God created nature and created men as creatures of nature. And as creatures of nature, men were equal, right? They were created equal. From that, he's now deduced all of these other steps about what this natural condition would have been and why men will feel it necessary to come to an agreement, a contract, to create a state, which of course, this Commonwealth or state is therefore a human invention. The state is not created by divine will. So he is clearly countering what used to be the kind of accepted doctrine in medieval Europe, and clearly we can see the transition that's taking place here in Europe. But he also counters the radical view, and this radical view was there in the Civil War period, by defending absolute sovereignty and the duty of non-resistance. By authorizing their representatives, the people give up all rights against the sovereign. So there could be there were in fact radical view of representation, which says, and we will see this later on if you happen to read Rousseau, for instance, and all of those doctrines leading up to the French Revolution, right? Where the argument would be that people actually don't necessarily give up all their rights, right? They still retain some rights against the sovereign. So Hobbes also, therefore, counters the radical view which says that even after the creation of the state, people still have the right to resist. Hobbes says, no, people do not have the right to resist because they've given up that right. What is the absolute sovereign? How can the state be an artificial person, right? How can it be an artifice as well as a person? How can it be both of those things at the same time? And it can be that through representation. If the state can be properly represented as an authorized agent, right, who can validly personate, that is to say, become that person by acting on its behalf. Okay, so the key question here is authorization. How is this representative an authorized agent? Once there is an authorization, a valid authorization, right, then the representative is the person, right, who represents the artificial creation called the state, right? So those who authorize the representative are equally the authors of the laws and actions of that representative. When men in nature enter into contract to create the sovereign power, it must own up to the actions of the sovereign to whom they have given their right to act on their behalf, right? We've already seen this. The sovereign is a natural person who acts on behalf of the state, which is the artificial collective body of the subject. So it is both an artificial creation because it is the collective body of all subjects. That is artificially created. But the sovereign is a natural person. It could be a monarch, or it can be a body of elected assembly, who are also natural persons, a body of natural persons, right? So both of those two things can happen at the same time. What are the rights of the sovereign? Now, this is where absolute sovereignty is explained. What is absolute sovereignty? Once all men have, by mutual contract, transferred all their prior rights to the sovereign, they cannot enter into new contracts. Right? They do not retain the right anymore to have any contracts. How can they? They've given away all their rights. Right? So they cannot enter into a new contract. Hence, they cannot change the form of the government. So once a monarch or a parliament has been declared, chosen as the representative authority, authorized representative, then people no longer have the right to change the monarch or to say, no, we don't like this parliament, we'll have another one. If anyone who wants to depose the sovereign is punished or killed by the sovereign, the one punished is himself the author of that punishment. Of course, this is the kind of circular logic that Hobbes has, in a sense, embedded in his whole construct. Because everyone is equally the author of everything that the sovereign does. Therefore, even if the sovereign were to punish a particular subject for not obeying, even let us say, executing that person, let's say, through a legal form, legal order, that person, as it were, is executing oneself, right? The sovereign cannot be held to be in breach of any contract with his subjects because he was not a party to the contract. You cannot say to a monarch or a parliament that you are breaching our contract, right? Because that person was not party to the contract. When a majority of the multitude choose their sovereign, those who dissented must also be bound by the acts of the sovereign. This we've already seen. The majority principle, decisions are made by majority, but those who did not vote are obliged to accept that decision of the majority. By being in the congregation, they had implicitly agreed to accept the choice of the majority. Thus, either they must submit to the decrees of the sovereign or return to the prior state of war in which they could be destroyed by anyone without causing any injustice. So look at this particular argument that Hobbes is making now. So once the Commonwealth or state has been created by contract, right? And as Hobbes says, that the representative is chosen by the major part, right? But everybody is obliged to accept the acts of this sovereign. Now, if someone says, I don't accept this choice of the majority, right? Either he then submits to the decrees of the sovereign, or if he does not want to do it, the only option that person has is to return to the state of nature. And in that state of nature, as we've explained many times, there is no law, there is no justice, right? So in that situation, one becomes an outlaw, in other words, right? In that situation, if he were to be destroyed by anyone, it doesn't even have to be the sovereign, by anyone, that person who has not joined this collective body, or who secedes from this collective body, right, can be destroyed. And there would be no injustice in this. Because in fact, that person has chosen to return to the condition of nature, where there is clearly no law, no right and wrong, no justice or injustice, right? So that's the completely watertight kind of set of arguments that Hobbes presents in favor of his theory of absolute sovereignty as the foundation of the state. A state that guarantees the common safety and common defense. What is absolute sovereignty? And then you can describe all of the implications of this. The sovereign has all executive, legislative, and judicial powers. So all of those things that we now accept as necessary, so-called division of powers, right? That is not accepted. The distinction between the executive branch and the legislative branch and the judicial branch as being separate authorities, nobody can interfere with the others. That is not Hobbes's argument, right? Because that Hobbes basically thinks that that will lead once more to a return to the state of nature, to that condition of warfare. The sovereign is the sole judge of what needs to be done to secure the people's common defense. No subject may justly criticize or complain about any act of the sovereign, because the contract makes every man the author of every action of the representative. The sovereign is also the sole judge of what opinions might endanger the state, and has the full right to examine and prohibit the public circulation of such opinions, right? So, freedom of opinion, freedom of the press, all of that is subject to the judgment of the sovereign about what opinions might endanger the common peace or the common self-defense. And if in the opinion of the sovereign, some opinions or some expression of maybe even criticism is likely to threaten that common defense, then the sovereign has the full right to examine and, if necessary, prohibit the public circulation of such opinions. The sovereign has the full powers to make rules to govern propriety that is good and bad, lawful and unlawful actions of his subjects. It is the sovereign that lays down what is proper and improper, right? What is right and wrong, what is lawful and unlawful. That is essentially the legislative power. The sovereign also has the powers of the judiciary and the right to settle controversies or disputes. That is the sovereign's right. The sovereign has the right to make war and peace with other nations. The rights of the sovereign are indivisible, and no part can be passed on to any other authority. So no division of powers here, right? It is, and all of it is motivated by Hobbes's fundamental objective, which is to leave nothing that could lead to a return to the condition of nature. Leave nothing that might lead men to claim some natural right to oppose the sovereign. Don't forget, this is Hobbes's understanding of the experience of the Civil War, right? That people began to claim natural rights against the sovereign. They began to say, we have a natural right to this or that, right? And we will oppose, resist the powers of the sovereign to do this. That leads to enmity, to war, to the beheading of the monarch, all right? All of that. Hobbes is writing precisely in that context. And you can see what the basic impetus is. How could men ensure that that condition of a war of all against war does not emerge again? And Hobbes's answer is, let people accept that fundamentally what they have to do is accept the authority of a mutually chosen representative as the sovereign. Okay? All their freedoms must be enjoyed within the limits that are set by this sovereign. The sovereign can set limits, right? And one has to trust the judgment of the sovereign to do this properly, adequately, to do what is necessary and not more. Okay, so Hobbes is clearly not saying that the monarch should be allowed to be a tyrant. But what he's saying is that choose a representative who you can trust to do this. But once you have chosen, you cannot retain rights against this sovereign, because that is opening the door to mutual distrust, enmity, and in the end to the destruction of the state through constant warfare. Now, is there any liberty of the subject? By agreeing to form the state, men give up their natural liberties and agree to obey the laws of the state. There are no natural liberties left anymore, right? But actually there is one natural liberty which men can never give up. The only liberty they retain is the right to protect themselves. which cannot be taken away by civil laws, because the object of the contract was to protect that right. Now, once again, go back to the distinction that Hobbes was making between the natural right that was like a law, the natural law. And the natural law was one of self-preservation. Now, that is a law that was not given by human beings, right? That is a law, not a law that is given by a sovereign or a parliament. The right to preserve oneself is something that flows out of nature itself, out of men's natural endowments. It is part of men's nature. The right to preserve oneself, to subsist, and to preserve one's life and one's possessions. Now, of course, Hobbes then says that if that is the only right and there's nothing else, then of course, as Hobbes describes, it's going to lead to this state of constant war. Because every man has this right and an equal measure of it. They will become enemies and will end up fighting one another all the time. To prevent this, they agree to give up all their rights to a representative whom they have chosen as sovereign. That is the state they have created. But there is a residual right which the sovereign does not give them, right? This is not a right which the sovereign has given them. This is not a right that has come to them by contract, which is the right to preserve oneself. Okay, if the state cannot protect him, this is the most interesting argument. If the state cannot protect him, the subject retains the right to protect himself. Now, this is a very, historically, this is a very interesting element. Hobbes is writing in the 17th century, of course, right? Over time, through the 18th, 19th, 20th century in particular, most places, there is a right of self-defense which is almost always conceded, right? So if somebody attacks me and there is no other law enforcing authority around me, right? Then presumably I do have the right to protect myself. And if that attacker is being violent and is using violence against me, and I have no other option except to retaliate with violence, right? Then the law in most countries will say, yes, you have a right to do it. There is a right of self-defense. Correct? Now, Hobbes is saying that this right actually could be interpreted in a way that people may, if they feel the state is unable to protect because of specific reasons, then people themselves can take steps to protect themselves. This is very interesting because I'm sure you've heard of this controversies, especially in a country like the United States, for instance, where the Constitution itself, the Second Amendment to the Constitution, which gives every person the right to bear arms. And people have often wondered why does one need this as a constitutionally protected right to bear arms. And of course, this led to a lot of debate because of the possession of guns in the United States and all of the gun violence that takes place. So the argument is that it is precisely the critics of the Second Amendment clearly say that look at the evidence, that it is because people have this protected right to own guns that in fact it leads to far greater violence than would be the case if people were not allowed to possess guns. And comparisons are made with a lot of countries where people do not, it's not so easy to procure guns. And the numbers of gun violence is much less, right? So the question there is raised, what is the better option for the preservation of peace in society, right? Or the prevention of violence in society? What is the better option? In Hobbes's terms, the option is that if, and it's left to the judgment of the subject, that if a subject believes that the state is unable to offer him the protection or ensure the protection that he deserves, then the subject has the right to protect himself, take steps to protect himself. That was the original idea behind the Second Amendment and the right to possess arms. It was considered a kind of fundamental right. And according to Hobbes's logic, it flows from a natural right. It flows from a natural right to protect oneself. Now, of course, in the context of the settlement by white Europeans following the conquest of the Americas, right? We know that history, broadly speaking, as we discussed on when we were discussing primitive accumulation, etc. The white settlers who, from the coast, they move in, taking over large portions of land, right? And for a long, long time, and maybe in many cases even today, right? Law enforcement in many of these settlements was actually quite scarce. The nearest police station would probably be a long way off. These farms, the settler farms, were very large farms, but they were widely separated, okay? And so, in a sense, the argument was, well, I can't rely on the state to protect me. I can't rely on the sovereign power to protect me. And so nobody can stop me from arming myself because I have a natural right to self-protection, even though I have agreed with everybody else to surrender my rights to a sovereign. That is not a right which anyone has surrendered. Okay, so that in a sense is the source. It goes back into 17th, 18th century thinking, which is clearly reflected here in Hobbes, that the right of self-protection is a natural right. And even though there is a law enforcing authority, there are laws, there are policemen, all of that, even then, if a subject feels that he or she is not protected, that he or she cannot rely on the state to protect life, then there is a natural right to arm oneself. Now, so that is one liberty that people do not give up. The right of to do what is necessary to preserve oneself. That is not given up. Hobbes then argues that acting out of fear is a free and valid act. So when you say, well, what is the status of this contract? Right? People are simply acting out of fear. Is this a valid contract? Are the laws made by the sovereign then valid? Because the sovereign simply has been chosen by people who were just so scared that they were, in a sense, unable to exercise their reason. But Hobbes counters this argument. He says, natural condition was marked by constant danger. Civil laws give subjects the liberty they can enjoy by imposing obligations on all. All right? It imposes obligations on all. So, imagine a situation when, in a natural condition, right, I want to engage a natural condition. I want to engage in agriculture. I take in lands, I expand my farms, right? In a natural condition, I would not be able to enjoy that natural liberty to prosper, because somebody else will interfere. Somebody else will stop me from doing it. Somebody else may attack me and take away my possessions and my lands, right? They may combine against me to take it away from me, right? So that whatever that liberty was, I would not be able to enjoy it. It's only when there are civil laws which actually recognize what possession is mine and what possession is not mine. So think of land, for instance. When you have civil laws, titles to land are clearly demarcated, right? Everybody knows, it is public knowledge, right, that this land belongs to me and the next piece of land belongs to you, right? And what the divisions are and so on are documented in government institutions, right? So yes, it is possible, for instance, to exchange pieces of land through sales, contracts, whatever else. I can sell my piece of land to you. That's fine, but you must first be certain that that piece of land belongs to me, actually, that I have the title, I have the authority to sell it. And that can be, you can always verify it through the usual legal procedures. So civil laws give subject the liberty they can enjoy by imposing obligations on all. You cannot take away things from me, just as I cannot take away things from you. Civil laws flow from a voluntary choice. By accepting their obligations, subjects remain free to act voluntarily. All right? I accept my obligations just as everybody else accept their obligations. That will leave everyone free to act voluntarily, whatever one wishes to do, right? One is free to do it. But that can only happen in a common way, in a common fashion, where everybody has that same freedom, right? That can only happen if a general condition of peace and security can be established first. Okay, so that is basically Hobbes's argument in Leviathan. His argument for a state which has absolute sovereignty and obligation, which again is absolute. There is no right of resistance. There is no right of resistance to the acts of the state. The only liberty that subjects retain is that fundamental liberty which comes from a law of nature, which is that of self-preservation. Right? So that is the overall framework. If there are any questions at this moment, because in the next class, we will talk about why most writers and thinkers on the state subsequently have disagreed with Hobbes, right? Most people have not, and in fact, it began in Hobbes's lifetime that people disputed this claim. The theory of absolute sovereignty, as we know, is not something that is generally approved of at all. The general understanding is, of course, that people should, even when a state is created, it is bound by certain fundamental laws. The state must be bound by certain fundamental laws, which is usually represented in a constitution. And the constitution lays down the limits beyond which the state cannot go, and citizens retain the right to act against the state, even within the law. For instance, one can go to court against government decisions. You can dispute a law, right? You can dispute an action of the state, of an authority of the state, right? You can go to court and say, this order or this law violates previous laws, or it violates the Constitution, right? So for instance, all of the things that you have in the Constitution, so-called fundamental rights. Now, those fundamental rights are, in fact, rights against the state too. So you can dispute a law of the state, an act of parliament, an act of any government department, right? Because it violates, let's say, the right of equality or the right of liberty, fundamental rights, right? You can go to court against the state. And most liberal constitutions will allow this. In Hobbes, you cannot have that. Hobbes, you cannot have that. In fact, this fundamental law, natural liberty, that is, one does not have legal recourse, even in Hobbes's scheme. So when I say I still retain the right to protect myself, right? All I can do is, of course, once you have a constitutional state, to extract from that state or that constitution the right to arm oneself. Okay, but everything that one does to protect oneself is not something one is doing through the authority of the law. All right. So, for instance, if I live in some farm somewhere and nobody is around, okay, and somebody attacks me, and there is no policeman, I cannot even call the police because it'll be too late before anybody can come. So I resort to violence in order to protect myself. Now, technically, that would still be an offense. It would still be a crime. I can then go to court and plead that I was acting in self-defense. That would have to be adjudicated in the law, whether that is a ground that will be admissible. The state will then decide, whoever is authorized by the state will decide whether it's an admissible argument. Okay? So that basic right, you are not exercising it as something against the state. It is some natural right that you possess, which nobody can give up. They cannot give it up because it is natural. Okay? Now, So that is the Hobbesian position on the sovereignty of the modern state. And as I said, there are lots of issues that have emerged subsequently where people have disputed this. And we will examine some of these arguments and consider really to what extent we can say that Hobbes is really not particularly relevant, because this is something, this is an idea that came up at sort of very early state of emergence of the modern state. You know, the idea of the modern state has now developed much further. We have much better ways of ensuring common safety and security, and we don't have to rely on any theory of absolute sovereignty. We will see to what extent that is actually valid, and in what ways Hobbes could be said to be, Hobbes can be dismissed in some ways. We'll consider that next time. But if there are any other questions on what we've discussed today, anything that is not clear, any confusions, please ask me.
Yes. Since the subject has no right to resistance, I was wondering what it means with regard to the right to self-preservation. What if the means to preserve oneself has to do with the right to resist?
No. Yes, that's what I actually explained, that the resistance is not to the for instance, the right to self-preservation. The idea is that I have agreed that the state will preserve the common condition of peace for everybody, right? And that will allow me to operate within the zones of freedom that I have, along with everybody else, to preserve myself. So as I said, I would be free to, let us say, to choose a livelihood, whatever is the livelihood that I am suited for, or the livelihood that I like, within those limits. I cannot choose a livelihood that depends on crime, right? Because that would violate the laws of the state, which are enacted to ensure the common freedom. So if I say that I want to be a robber, oh, I like that. I love being a robber, and that is the livelihood I will pursue. But clearly, that will endanger the possessions of other people. Correct? So the common right of self-preservation will not be fulfilled there. So we basically, by forming the Commonwealth or the state, we are depending or we are accepting the authority of the state or the representative to make the best judgment on what restrictions are necessary on our natural freedoms so that we can actually preserve ourselves. Now, if it so happens that in a particular context, at a particular time, because of a particular situation, I find that I am unable to preserve myself and the state cannot do anything to preserve myself, then do I have the right to do what I think is necessary? So for instance, you could, I was thinking of the question of violent attacks and the possibilities that I may have to resist violently. But think of something else. Think of a situation where somebody is completely going without food. There is no food. Okay? And there is no way that he can legitimately find food. Right? And the state will not, you might say that that person goes to some government authority and still is unable to find food. is that person then entitled to take somebody else's food to preserve oneself? Right? Now, those become the interesting questions. And you can think of, many novels and movies and so on, fiction, where that is precisely the situation that is described, with almost the claim that in a situation like that, one is justified to steal in order to preserve oneself. Right? Now, that is the residual right. But again, one is even within this claim of the natural right, even in that situation, one would not say that I have a right to act against the laws of the state. Yes, I have done this in this extreme situation to preserve myself, but it is still within the rights of the state authorities or whoever has been stolen. Right? I take bread from the shop. Then the shop owner is within his right to complain against me because I have stolen. Right? And then it becomes an interesting question. Should the state then have made arrangements so that somebody does not starve? Those are actually questions of policy that we face today, right? That it is in fact a responsibility of the government. Now, in Hobbes' terms, that flows from the basic claim of self-preservation. That everyone has that basic natural right. A basic natural right. So in a sense, when you have a constitution, for instance, the right to liberty, it includes the right to life. The right to life, right? And the right to life includes precisely all of these things, to the means of livelihood. And very often, for instance, all of these things that we now have, for instance, about, supply of food, ensuring food supplies in times of scarcity and so on and so forth. These are not just policy, we often think of it as legal obligations of the state. Why? Precisely because they are part of this responsibility that the sovereign actually accepts to preserve the lives and properties, preserve the possessions of all subjects. Right? Okay, so let's end here. We'll meet again on Friday. I will need to do this wonderful job of taking your attendance. But
before you do that, Partha, I will end the live streaming for today.
yes, please do.
Is it live streaming?